Hi, my name is Kanal, and welcome to the Geeks of the Valley podcast, which connects with some of the brightest minds globally who are leading their respective industries today to discuss the hottest upcoming industry trends and how their work is affecting the global economy. What started off as a coffee chat has now grown into a global platform for visionaries. This morning, from the San Francisco Bay Area, we have partners Dave Goldblatt and Tim Ryan joining us today from Vibe Capital. Prior, Dave was ex-product and operations at Facebook and built a social audio company called Wave Chat. Tim, on the other hand, founded a health tech startup, which was acquired, has been involved in Web3 and cryptography by helping launch an exchange, and was part of the founding team at Zepp Labs. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. How are things with you?
Great, thank you.
Doing well, a little under the weather, but overall pretty good.
What are your thoughts on the recent events in the crypto space in relation to FTX?
This is Dave here. Overall, I think it's a huge distraction from the longer term vision and mission and value add that crypto and Web3 has to offer. If you dive a little bit deeper, all the decentralized platforms have worked entirely as expected, and this is just a centralized scam run amok under the pretenses of crypto and Web3.
Yeah, and this is Tim here. Just from my perspective, I think a lot of this is actually good for the industry because it brings a lot of oversight and regulation, which was much needed, and specifically in the U.S. because outside of the U.S. there's a little less rules and regulations, and things kind of flow more freely. But here in the capital markets in the U.S., like we have securities laws and things like that, and government bodies like the SEC, and a lot of that will be kind of addressed in the coming months and years ahead. So, overall, I'd say something to be aware of, but we'll see what comes of it.
Let's jump into the first question here, shall we?
Yep.
Tell me about yourself and your background and how it led to both of you of building Vibe Capital together.
Sure. Yeah, Tim, you wanna go first?
For sure. Yeah. So my background's pretty entrepreneurial. I was at a sports tech company coming out of school. It's called Zepp Labs down in the South Bay here in the Bay Area. I grew up in the Bay Area, did my undergrad here, and then I did grad school over in Europe. But coming back, you see kind of the .com one, and just it's all technology all the time. So got involved in kind of a sports tech startup that was doing sensors, MEMS, gyros, accelerometers, and we partnered with Apple, Verizon, and Best Buy, and some of the big sports like the San Francisco Giants and Tennis Association, PGA Tour, things like that. And you got to see kind of from, this was like 2010 through 15 that I was there. You got to see like really from the inside of how to build a company from nothing to shipping product to global distribution. And at our peak we're doing about 15 million in revenues, and multiple stages of fundraisings from the pre-seed and kind of family and friends round all the way through like a seed and ultimately like Series B, and the company did list eventually. But I think just being in there from the start, and I would just recommend to any founders, if you're curious or thinking about starting something, the best way if you're kind of on the fence is join a early company when there's a lot of founders or maybe like senior executives that are kind of debating whether or not they should start companies. And I think one of the best ways to really learn is like you're kind of drafting off a founder that has raised some capital and kind of has a product already established, and you'll learn very quickly on a small team of maybe 5, 10, 15 people. And so I learned, like, my mentor, he was at Apple, and before that he sold a company into Cisco and things like that. So you can really learn a lot in that kind of framework. And then from there, I went on and started my own. That was that kind of health tech company in the medicinal cannabis space. And eventually I moved more into kind of an advisory and kind of board role as that kind of exited. And got deeper kind of into the blockchain, cryptography, and kind of Web3 space, where there's an exchange here in San Francisco. This was kind of the 2017 run up with, the last iteration of kind of ICOs and tokens were listing, and you kind of went from like the 1 or 2 or 10 chains where, Bitcoin and Ethereum were kind of the main ones, and a few others. And then there's this explosion, partly because of ERC20 tokens, and everyone could kind of use that core kernel of code and then essentially make any use case for any decentralized application. So it is an interesting time to be in the space. We're going through another interesting time now, and I'm sure Dave will talk about it. He's got some strong opinions too. But we're long-term builders and long-term investors too. So whether or not there's ups or down, it's like the stock market. Things will go up, and I've always been told it's like a yo-yo on an escalator, right? Like over the long term, if you're in it long enough, and Warren Buffett's kind of the master at this, you're creating real value creation. So ultimately, it's going to rise in the long term. And this is not investment advice, but we're really focused on kind of building and investing in kind of these early stages. And I can go deeper a little bit later, but I'll pass it off to Dave from there.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Give a background about myself. Coming out of undergrad, basically right out of undergrad, I started working at Facebook. This was in a customer support role, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. It was user facing, where someone could write into info@facebook.com, and I would reset their password or tell them how to add a profile picture. There were 180 or so people when I joined Facebook. Now, pre-layoffs, there were 87,000 at Meta. Now there are 76,000. So learned, and I think there were 50,000 by the time my time ended there in 2017. So I saw quite a bit and grew quite a bit from 180 people to 50,000 people and 10 million people on Facebook to 2 billion across Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Oculus, probably forgetting some other services. But really that shaped my worldview in understanding just how powerful technology-enabled protocols, systems, and tools were. And coming out of that, I wanted to do a startup, do my own thing. I can talk a bit around why I think social audio will be a thing, but not until there's the next computing platform like AR/VR. After winding that down in early 2020, right before COVID, I had always been involved in angel investing, and I really started to grow a fondness for investing because of the multidisciplinary approach that was required and the breadth of understanding, as opposed to the very narrow focus of building a product, especially at the early stages. So participated in the OnDeck Angel Investing Fellowship and was connected with AngelList and saw that there was a very easy way to spin up a fund, which I did. I spun up the Fund 1 for Vibe Capital in July of 2021. It was on the AngelList platform using the rolling fund instrument. And that has gone, I would say, very well so far. Obviously, it's only been 18 months or so, but we've already seen quite a few markups. Got connected with Tim in October of 2021, worked together for a few months, and then he came on and we decided to pursue this a little bit further. And then we decided to raise our fund to traditional $10 million fund in around April or May. And that's what we're doing right now. And sure. I can dive more into how we reached our thesis and what the past year or so has taught us, but I'll pause there.
And, taking a step back and really looking at your fund, can you walk us through your strategy investing into Web3, AI, and deep science?
Yeah, taking a step back from why Web3, why AI, why deep science. What do we really think is happening in the world? So Tim and I had this discussion actually, again a few weeks ago of like, what do we look for in startups at the pre-seed and the seed stage? Obviously, founders have to be great. Obviously, the product needs to solve a real problem, but the biggest thing is the market and what is happening in the macro environment. If you look at the technologies that are starting to become adopted in the way that they're interacting with macro changes in the world. So thinking about that, like what is happening in the world right now? It's 2022. Most of the systems that exist, whether it be government, finance, media, health, any of these power structures, they've been around and been in power since basically post World War II. Now you take a look at the world, and the world is very different than post World War II. And because of that, the systems that are in place are not working anymore. Government isn't working anymore. And speaking from a US, but also global point of view, finance not really working anymore, doesn't work for the majority of people. Healthcare doesn't work, media doesn't work. There are multiple realities of how people think about news and editorialization. So we took a look at that and said, all right, what does this remind us of, and what do we think is gonna happen? Very similar to the Reformation. I don't know how many people know European history, but Martin Luther posted a list of all these things that were wrong with the Catholic Church, which was the predominant power structure in the world at the time. And coming out of that, there was the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, which was a dramatic shift in the world from several hundred years earlier. This was spurred on by the printing press, which was the major technological innovation. We think that the technologies of artificial intelligence, which essentially, if Steve Jobs says the computer is the bicycle for the mind, AI is the Iron Man suit for the mind. It's gives people superpowers, basically, in dealing with large sets of data and decision making, and tooling for being able to manipulate software and then eventually hardware. Crypto and Web3, which disintermediates the trust layer. So if you take a look at any power structure, they all have a centralized point of authority. The government, everything goes to the centralized point of authority. That's how people interact in a nation state. Healthcare, it goes through a doctor or the insurance systems. Media, it goes through the New York Times or Fox News or whoever. By getting rid of that third party, people can start to interact one-on-one and rebuild their communities from the ground up in new and interesting shapes and configurations. And then finally, deep science is really the application of technology to the physical world. So if you take a look at 1970, the way that people communicate is incredibly different. Everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. You can send full videos and it gets there in under a second. But in the physical world, not much has changed. It still takes 45 minutes to drive from Palo Alto to San Francisco. Plane rides still take 6 hours if you want to ship a pallet of things. Like, yes, logistics have improved, but not by a ton. Where are my flying cars, basically? So we think these three things are all going to start to hit their exponential curves right at the same time, and the impact is going to be mind-boggling. So I'll pause there, and that is what we are investing towards, is people who share the same macro outlook. And I know Tim wants to chime in with something.
No, I'm completely 100% aligned with Dave, and we're partners, so we've discussed this, and even some of the founders, they're very much aligned with how we kind of think, long term, and where the industry is going as a whole, and the world, as Dave was kind of laying out there. But at the core of like venture capital, there's different levels and kind of different ways that you can either start a fund or invest in a fund, or Dave and I are constantly talking to other investors. Like, many people might not know, but like, you just think of Sequoia Capital or Excel or Lightspeed, or these huge funds, Andreessen on Sand Hill Road. And that's where all the founders are like, oh great, this is who I go to get our capital. But a lot of the venture funds, they have to go up to their investors too, which are oftentimes at that stage, it's oftentimes endowments and universities and pension funds and sovereign wealth for the really big ones, right? But at the smaller scale, even at the very smallest, right, it might just be a solo GP or a couple angel friends that gather together and they're writing kind of small checks. But ultimately, like, you have to be mindful of the macro markets and look at the public equities, not just in the US and Europe and China itself, right? Or Asia. I know you're based out there. But if that starts dipping, right, and we've already lost, I think it's 30%, depending on which index you're looking at, 15 to 30, call it that. Like that has a adverse effect in terms of who's raising the capital when. A lot of these funds have raised previously in the kind of pandemic era of like 2020, 2021, going into 2022, and then everything kind of paused. So they're sitting on a lot of dry powder. But if you're a founder, you really want to know, like, how much capital have they raised? Who are some of these other investments that they've deployed to? Who's kind of their target focus? Because ultimately it does matter. And just, Dave and I's conversations with other investors, we're pretty well connected, not only at the kind of pre-seed and seed stage, which we like, but also, our kind of model is, get that 0 to 1 from, the founders. We've even at the napkin stage where it's really just, founder referrals and trust. Maybe they've had a multiple exit, all the way up to, like university graduates or multiple time founders, or they just left, Apple or Google or Meta or Twitter or something, right? Like, there's different types of founders, and you just have to know kind of who you're backing, but also from a founder's perspective, like which firm you're going to go with, and then also which partner and who you're going to be working with there, because it does matter. And one of our kind of longer term thesis that we like to say is play long-term games with long-term players. And that means, like, who are you working with? And like, it really is almost like a lot of these companies are longer than some marriages, right? So who your investors are, they're going to be on your team, and you want them in your corner when things go bad, like the Theranos, which is in the news now, or the FTX. Like, that's when your investors, the ones that really care, you're going to know, because they're going to have your back. And the ones that don't and just gave you the money, that you're not going to hear from them.
Fair point here, guys. And when it comes to thinking through major Web2 funds and that transition into the Web3 industry with billions of dollars to invest, how do you see that changing the landscape in your eyes?
So there are a couple things that you can I think take away from their approaches. Maybe you've heard of the innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen. I think it applies to it. For people who aren't aware, I'll explain it, but I'll probably butcher it. But let's say you're IBM in the 80s, and you see that desktop computers are coming, or the internet is coming, but your entire business model is mainframe computers. You have one of two options. One option is you maintain the same status quo because you're the world leader in selling mainframe computers, and you just kind of put your head in the sand. And two is you attempt to completely change what it is you're doing, and thereby give credence and give your blessing to these new startups that, through virtue of their speed and their culture, are paving the way for these new paradigms, like, a Dell computer, or if you go even further down the line, like a Snapchat. So I think the same thing applies to traditional VC firms. Not that they're incapable of making the transition and becoming and understanding what exactly is necessary to support a Web3 company or protocol versus a Web2 company or protocol, but it takes a lot of work to disrupt yourself on a personal level, and it takes even more work to disrupt something that is going extraordinarily well to thrive in a new landscape and ecosystem. So some of the things that, and I think Andreessen, obviously it remains to be seen what their funds look like after a few years, but I think Andreessen has done a great job of leading the way here, where they've fully embraced decentralization, have invested in pseudonymous founders, are contributing to like GitHub repositories of and code bases of some of these decentralized protocols, being good ecosystem partners. That's the kinds of things that you want and need to be able to speak the same language as the people who are building the future. Now, the other big question is, they've raised so much money, and is the ecosystem even prepared to invest, $100 billion or whatever the case may be into Web3? I am not quite sure. Like, are there even enough founders or startups in the world that are good enough to use that much money, and are they at that stage yet? Probably not. So it's an interesting question. I would be, I think funds like Andreessen are doing a great job. They might have gotten out, put the cart in front of the horse a little bit and gotten out a little bit too far in front of their skis, but they're generally doing the right things.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what Dave's saying, I mean, ultimately change is difficult and hard for almost everyone. I mean, everybody, you kind of get into a rhythm, you get into a flow, just on individuals, families, friends, everything, right? You kind of have routines, but also, when you disrupt things, like, that's kind of the quote unquote buzzword, but things get thrown off, right? And you go down a different path. And there was a time when everybody had Nokia phones, right? And there was that snake game, right? And everybody was, using SMS messages, right? And then BlackBerry came along, right? And then out of nowhere, Apple drops the iPhone, right? And then Google comes out with Android. And next thing we know, we have 3 billion mobile phones, or whatever the number is. And it allows for a new ecosystem, essentially, right? Where now you have developers that in the early 2000s, when there was like the first wave of desktop and .com 1.0 or whatever you want to call it, there was no mobile. You couldn't develop on it, right? Or if you could, it didn't have the distribution to get to literally half the globe, right? And all of this, it doesn't just come overnight. Like, all that infrastructure, you had to go from, like, the networks had to get upgraded to 3G, and now we're on 5G, or LTE or whatever it is. And all of it kind of happened slowly, but then suddenly. And then next thing you know, Apple's like a couple trillion, Google's a couple trillion, Amazon, right? I mean, you can cut it in half because of the public markets, but they're still really, really valuable companies. And if you look at the advertising models, how kind of Meta and Google and Twitter, for better or worse, that all was built, literally kind of on mobile. And it also enabled, during the pandemic, for the economy to just not grind to a halt, discounting all the kind of financial mechanisms that went into place. And we're dealing with some of those repercussions now, but the people were able to have their Amazon deliveries if you're in the States or Western Europe, and same with like food deliveries and medicines and things like that. And I think all of this technology, yeah, I mean, we can like laugh at Twitter and talk about all the committees, investigation committees with Facebook during election cycles and things like that. But, there's not really good or bad. It's the tool. It's how you use it, right? I mean, a shovel could be bad too, right? Or it could dig trees and, plant the future, right? So you just have to think about how you are viewing things and in what context and on what time scale.
You are one of the very few emerging funds which put emphasis on deep science startups. What is your motivation behind this?
Couple things. One, I touched on this earlier, and that is around the relative lack of change we have seen in the physical world over the past 50 or so years. So that's the first thing around there's so much opportunity there. First thing. Second thing is there's a narrative shift amongst, I wouldn't say everyone in the world, or it's something that you could ask a person on the street and they would tell you that this is something that is happening. But I think amongst builders on Twitter and quote unquote thought leaders, people like Peter Thiel and Eli Dorado, Carlota Perez, around there's now an appetite again to build in these spaces. And then third, I think the underlying technologies provide incentives to move forward in these spaces where prior, in the 60s, you would need the resources of an entire government to shoot someone into space and make that kind of progress. Now with artificial intelligence and machine learning progressing at the rate that it is progressing, the sheer number of participants in the world that have access to nearly infinite information and collaboration tools via the internet and mobile phones, and decentralized financing structures through crypto and Web3, you get information and education, you get appetite and behavior change, you get participation that's 1,000x, and then you get money. That makes me, and you also get this huge market of like, if you can start manipulating physical space in a similar manner that you can with software, and you see all the amazing stuff we've done with software over the past 40 years, then you really start to get an excellent sci-fi future that could be really groundbreaking for society and humanity.
And when it comes to your thesis, you mentioned climate change as a driver of volatility. Could you talk more to this point? It's just very interesting that as a Web3 AI deep science fund, that there's this climate change angle.
Yeah, I mean, so all things being equal, this presupposes that people still have access to running water, clean air, electricity. They're not forced out of their homes by floods and other huge events that push people towards migration. Listen, like, working on a decentralized finance startup is great, but if your house is underwater or there are wildfires that are, pushing you to move somewhere else, you're probably not going to be able to do it. So this is going to push, necessity is the mother of all invention. There was a huge amount of turmoil in the 1930s and 1940s, and coming out of that, we saw the boom of the 50s and the 60s and lots of technological innovation. This is really going to be a forcing function, similar to how COVID was a forcing function for lots of leaps and breakthroughs in various areas.
To add on to what Dave's saying, I mean, we're not the only ones that, are kind of agreeing with this. There's the huge COP27 summit. One of our portfolio founders was actually out there, a lot of energy and, kind of the ways that governments are devoting resources, or how, advanced economies and kind of developing economies are sharing the burden and, the future. I don't think just creating, this is just my personal view, it might or might not reflect others. I don't think creating pools of capital and then everybody fighting over the pie is the way to solve it. I honestly think it's through innovation and technology where, the future advancements of maybe it's in new ways that we have urban living, or more climate sustainable ways of, like Dave was saying, electricity. And there's huge droughts in the West out here. They're talking about desalinization. They're doing a lot of that in Israel as well. So I think there's a way that we can kind of, everybody, and we've been doing it for decades, kind of stick your head in the sand and just try to fight for what's left, or you can innovate your way out. And we're not the only ones saying this. I mean, John Doerr, who's a very famous, successful venture capitalist here in Silicon Valley over many, many decades. He invested, I think, the largest in the last, few decades in creating a new school. It's the School of Sustainability at Stanford University, right? And it's to focus, because his thesis in theory is that the next, Googles and Apples and Facebooks or Metas and all that is going to come, because you're solving huge problems that are going to affect every person on the planet, right? And so that's one of the reasons, being in this space and kind of in this domain, like, we see an opportunity as well.
So looking at this from a macro view perspective, where you refer to near future equals reformation and renaissance, could you elaborate more on this?
Just to start off, history never repeats, but it often rhymes, because who are the main participants in history? Humans. Humans haven't really changed since we were on the plains of sub-Saharan Africa 150,000 years ago. It's the same mechanics, the same chemistry. So things tend to play out somewhat similarly. So the Reformation was 1500s. Martin Luther posted a treatise where he says these are all the things that are wrong with the power structure. A lot of change came out of that, and that led to the Renaissance, and a complete overhaul of who was in charge and what the power structures were. More equitable, more just, more transparent. Of course, nowhere near close to perfect in terms of equity and justice and transparency, but a lot better than in the Dark Ages. And we think something similar is going to happen on a much more compressed timeline across the entire world. So these things could only happen in Europe, because the power structures of the Catholic Church, who was the predominant power structure at the time in Europe, was the only power that was being affected by the Reformation. But now we're sort of in a global collective intelligence of the internet. You see, I don't know if you saw, but Elon Musk literally just posted a Twitter poll asking, should Donald Trump be brought back onto Twitter? And that is now how things work. It's just a Twitter poll, and everyone in the world gets to vote on it. So the speed, it's not going to take hundreds of years. It'll probably take somewhere between 10 and 20 years. But I'll bet you a lot of money that in 15 to 20 years, things are going to look very, very, very different than they did 15 years ago now, which was 2007. The rate of change is just going to increase quite a bit.
And for sure, because that's the only constant in life and in the world is change, right? It might come slower, but ultimately we're all changing. Every cell in your body is changing. And I think, just real quick to wrap on this point, what Dave was just talking about, ultimately technology, as I was saying earlier, like it's how you use it. Can it be used for good or bad? It's neither. It's just what is the way that it's used. And I think there's a lot of technologies that are being developed now that will have applications and uses in the next 10, 15, 20 years, and generations for your kids and your grandkids that we don't even know, right? And I think we have to be mindful of how we're thinking about how these are going to be used by many people and many different use cases. And everything is not a panacea. Like one technology isn't used for everyone. But I will say, like, for all its faults, and everybody loves to dump on tech, especially when things are a little chaotic and crazy at times, but for better or worse, like most people, it's pretty much advanced a lot of humans' lives in terms of the way that we've been able to, just using electricity, right? And a lot of people take that for granted, but 200 years ago, there was no electricity and we're all using candles and stuff, right? Even the wealthiest person, or the JP Morgans or Carnegies, like they couldn't afford it. And if they did, it was very, very expensive, right? Because they were subsidizing those costs so that everyone could have it. And it was a commodity at one point. So in the future, a lot of these things that are very new or very expensive, like electric vehicles, or, we're big AI investors in self-driving cars and deliveries and things like that, and flying rockets or whatever. Like, it's all funny and kind of space tech or, sci-fi. But in the future, it takes investment and capital and risk, and then that becomes more commoditized if all society, agrees to use it in the future.
On the other hand, you have a very interesting approach to investing, which is towards oyster and pearls. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's a terminology. I forget where I stole it from, but okay, let's say you're diving and you see an oyster. I actually am allergic to shellfish, but before I became allergic to shellfish, I loved oysters, and that's kind of the treasure. But it takes a lot of force to get the treasure from outside that hard exterior. That's the one of the sets of companies that we're investing in. Hey, it's a hard nut to crack, but if you crack it open, the rewards are immeasurable. And this is similar to, we invested in a company called Rosotics, which is trying to revolutionize 3D printing. We invested in a company called Pipe Dream Labs, which is attempting 30-second delivery via underground tubes. So incredibly difficult to do, but hey, you crack it open, that's $1 trillion. And then there are the things that are just like not necessarily easy to do, but more obvious. And there's less of a lift from a changing the perception of the world, kind of work, where these things are already in the vanguard a little bit, but they still have a measurable value. Things like we invested in an AI safety startup called Mission Control, or Take Control.ai. And people understand the need for AI safety, but it's still a difficult task. But if you get it right, you can sell to every business in the world. So those are the two types of companies that we really look for. Both have to have more than 10x, hopefully 100x returns. Not financial advice.
To wrap up our call with our last question for the day, what piece of advice would you give to people out there from the journey you've had thus far in life?
Yeah, I think top of mind is place asymmetric bets. What asymmetric means is, okay, the worst that could happen is it goes to zero, but the best that could happen, it happens is it 1,000 X's or 10,000 X's. An asymmetric bet would be something like building a startup or investing $1,000 into Bitcoin in 2013. Something that, and I'm not saying bet your rent on it or whatever the case may be, but put yourself in a position to make these asymmetric bets, because those are the ones that have completely outsized returns on the trajectory of your life. And it doesn't have to just be financial. It could be interpersonal or another community building or something else.
Yeah, I would just say, we're all figuring it out as we go. I don't mean that facetiously, but if somebody says they have all the answers, might question twice, because especially being in new technologies, there's things that we see that you don't even know what's coming, right? So I think it's exciting in the sense of like, you get a glimpse kind of into the future sometimes, which is super cool. A lot of these are going to fail. Dave and I have been on both sides of that, both as an investor and a founder. That being said, there's brilliant successes as well. And I think, having all of that, I just to wrap it up, I'd say somebody once, mentor advisor told me, if you can answer what, you'll have a job, for life. If you can answer why, you'll be that person's boss. And just to kind of enunciate or dig, double click, as we like to say on that, a lot of times you kind of answer like, what am I doing? Who am I doing it with? And then why? And you'll answer in that order. And I've come to find, and especially as I've gotten a little older and a little more mature, if you answer that in reverse and you really focus and start on like, why am I doing this? Like, on anything, right? In your career, in your life, with your partners, whoever, and then bringing it back to like, who are you doing it with? Because that's really like your tribe, and your family, friends, colleagues, all that really matters ultimately. And then then you really focus on what you're doing and kind of figure out your plan and action and go forward from there. But it's a short life. We're all here on this spinning rock for just a blip of time, so make the most of it.
So for people out there who are interested in maybe catching a cup of coffee with you or reaching out to you, Tim and Dave, what would be the best point of contact?
Yeah, I am on Twitter at Dave Goldblatt. I also, feel free to email me, dave@vibecap.co. I'm in San Francisco, so happy to grab a coffee there. And if you are interested in becoming an LP in our fund, we are a 506c fund, so I can advertise becoming an LP. Our fund 2 still has allocation open. Go to vibecap.co and you can check out our portfolio companies in fund 2. Again, email dave@vibecap.co and we can have a conversation.
And any founders that are interested and aligned and just curious or want to meet, you can always ping us at vibes@vibe.co.
Dave and Tim, it was a pleasure having you on Geeks of the Valley, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Python, an Asian-based open source enterprise software company. Python offers a suite of software applications and infrastructure services to scholars and universities.